Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 5 greatest orchestras for connoisseurs, sequel to the 5 greatest conductors for connoisseurs. You came up with some wonderful lists in the last one, and one of you asked to do this one. So I said, sure, why not? Let's do it, even though I have some other things planned as we conclude our 5 greatest. We're in the last, week or so of these. And so, and before we start the next project, which I think is going to be equally cool, frankly, but the 5 greatest orchestras for connoisseurs bear some resemblance to, of course, my own personal list of the 10 greatest orchestras, because I'm a connoisseur, naturally. But there are some differences too. And we're talking about orchestras that are not in the big splashy top whatevers. No Berlin, no Vienna, no Chicago, no London Symphony or Philharmonia. None of those people. None at all. We're going to be talking about orchestras that don't get as much recognition, but really have so much personality, so much character, so much specialness in the way they sound and the way they play. And I have to emphasize, this is during their golden age on disc. I want to make this very clear, because when we're talking about conductors, it's like, it's not so bad. I saw him last week. He sounded great. No, that's not the point. We're always talking about recordings here. That's what this channel is about. Live performances are irrelevant. Your opinion of what happened at a live performance is irrelevant, because the rest of us can't share in that. The reason it's irrelevant isn't because it doesn't mean anything. It's because the whole point of talking about recordings is that we have an ability to have a conversation from the same basis, from hearing the same thing, not just getting one person's opinion of a one-off event that can never be repeated. So some of these orchestras do not sound the way that they used to sound. In fact, some of them don't even exist. But we're going to be talking about this nonetheless. The 5 greatest orchestras for connoisseurs on disc, at their best. So we're clear on that, right? First, the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, which is actually at its best. It's always been at its best. It's an amazing orchestra. The Pittsburgh Symphony was never one of the American Big Five. The American Big Five were, for the record, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Cleveland. 5. But there were always others who were really fantastic orchestras. And, they never got much attention or much attention from record labels or much credit or whatever. We talked about, when we're talking about conductors and Slatkin, St. Louis was one. The list goes on and on. I mean, we can go San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta. There's at least 10, probably 10 others, Minnesota, who are, on any given day, just phenomenal ensembles. But here we're talking about the Pittsburgh Symphony. And what is it that makes the Pittsburgh Symphony so special? Well, the Pittsburgh Symphony is the closest the United States gets to the Vienna Philharmonic. It has the best horn section in the universe, probably even better than Vienna. It's got an amazing brass section, characterful woodwinds, gorgeous strings, absolutely beautiful strings. It has all the warmth and that sort of burnished sound that we get from the Vienna Philharmonic, especially under Manfred Honeck, who's, Viennese. I mean, he's Austrian. He knows the sound that, he's shooting for there. It has all of that, but even more rhythmic aptitude and discipline, a better ensemble characteristics as often as not. And so I just think that they're an amazing and characterful group. So that's one ensemble. The next, the Staatskapelle Dresden. Now, the Staatskapelle Dresden was always, in my view, the great German orchestra. There was a problem with appreciating that. They were in Eastern Europe, so their recordings weren't as well known. but boy, are they good. They were the anti-Karajan sound. Not that there was anything wrong with Karajan. Let me be straight. Some people say, oh, I hate him. I don't. He did amazing things, and he had an extraordinary sound, and he turned the Berlin Philharmonic into the model orchestra for sonority here in the West. It was never my model. And Karajan never had quite the cachet over in this part of the world that he had in Europe, because he didn't control as much here. He wasn't in charge of, like, in Europe. He had Salzburg and Vienna and Berlin, and he did all the operas, and he did all the concerts, and he did, here, our opinion of him was rather more equivocal. But that's not the point. With all due props for what Karajan was, the Staatskapelle Dresden could not have a sound that was more different from the Berlin Philharmonic. It was Richard Strauss's favorite orchestra. And when Karajan conducted the Staatskapelle Dresden in Meistersinger, magic happened, because he couldn't impose his attitude on them. They had to meet somewhere in the middle. And so it was really rather cool. But this orchestra played with plays with transparency and clarity and great individuality within each section. They have a brass section that's not a homogenized glop of sound, as it became with the Berlin Phil under Karajan. I think their ideal of orchestral sonority is far more appealing than what Karajan eventually created. At the beginning, Berlin was like, wow, amazing. But after a while, it began like, sticky, tacky, But no, they have wonderful woodwinds. They're much closer to the other Central European orchestras, like, the Czech Phil, about which more shortly, and groups like that. So the Staatskapelle Dresden, I think, is an incredible, incredible group. They stamped their personal sonority on everything they did. Nowhere more so than in the Bruckner symphonies with Eugen Joachim, or Ottmar Sweetener's recording of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, where they go completely crazy, and it's just totally fabulous. So there's that. Next, the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. This is an orchestra that I've always loved. Under Alexander Gibson, the strings were a little scruffy here and there. They had an incredible low brass section. Their bass trombonist, I've said a million times, was incredible. But they had a certain rough and ready energy that was the opposite of this sort of comfortable style, the idea of just this sort of comfortable, cushy sonority. It was never what they did. And when Järvi got them and they started doing the Prokofiev symphonies and the Richard Strauss tone poems, they sounded absolutely wonderful. And again, it's because of the very lack of blend. Not that they couldn't blend. They can blend when they needed to blend, right? They know how to balance their tone within each section. That wasn't the issue. The issue is that they were able to give a distinctive color to everything they did, because each group of instruments within the whole had its personality. And so there was always this sort of give and take and tension in the way that they played that I think energized a lot of the repertoire that they did. So I think, Sibelius, stuff like that, they were just wonderful in that music. Absolutely wonderful. Next, I mentioned them, the Czech Philharmonic, of course. The Czech Philharmonic is one of the great European ensembles, or it was, under Talich and Anschirl, particularly Anschirl, and Václav Neumann, most of his career. Now I wonder how much of that wonderful, unique sonority is really left. Under Bychkov, they don't sound particularly distinctive. Under, some of the other international conductors, for some reason, maybe now that they have, who do they have? Jakob Ruscha or something like that. Maybe it's coming back. Maybe they will recapture some of their character, which was a sonority based on leonine strings, a sort of wiry string sound, unbelievably characterful woodwinds, tangy brass with lots of vibrato, horns that could be woodwind or brass instruments. Really, really a fantastic sound. And you can hear it in anything that Anschirl did. One of the things that, sort of is a testament to what they could do when they were at their best. I think, is the Henschel recording of Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, where, you've got Mravinsky and Leningrad, who are supposed to be the standard, right? It's Mravinsky, it's Leningrad. You will play or you will go to the Gulag, I mean, that was Mravinsky. And they sounded like they were terrified all the time, and they could do amazing things. I mean, with incredible discipline, at times. But, Mravinsky wouldn't make studio recordings, and you go hunting around for days to try and find a decent recording of Shostakovich's 10th. And then Henschel takes him into the studio at the same time. Remember, this is mono. This was within a couple of years of the piece being written. Brand new music. And just blows the roof off with it, plays the daylights out of it, and puts Leningrad to shame. Really a fascinating testament to not just their distinctive sonority as an Eastern European orchestra, but also their standards of discipline and performance. And in a small country, just an amazingly musical place with a phenomenally musical orchestra. And last but not least, an orchestra that doesn't exist any longer, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. Now, the Orchestra de l'Association, the Orchestra de I can't even pronounce it. Association of the Society of the Concerts des Conservatoires. That's what it was. L'association. Yeah, l'association. La Société de l'Association des Concerts du Conservatoire. There, that's as close as I'm going to get. And I'm going to stop because I know it's driving you crazy. No, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which was disbanded in the mid-'60s to make room for the Orchestra de Paris, which was like a big mistake. And with that, we lost an entire school of French playing. Now French orchestras sound like everybody else. They really do, except possibly Lamoureux, if they're still around. I mean, they're around somewhere, but, Lamoureux was another one of those orchestras that was similar, actually. They could have made this list, but no, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra had the most recordings. And they had the Beethoven cycle with Schuricht, and all the Ravel with Cuitins. And, this was an orchestra that was founded in 1828-29 by Francois Habeneck for the purpose of playing Beethoven. They are the longest, continuous, unbroken tradition of instrumental performance going back to Beethoven's day. So all of the period instrument people should just go jump in a lake, because we have the tradition, and that was it. And thank God they were around long enough to do the Beethoven symphonies, and we can hear what they sound like. Not that it sounded exactly that way in Beethoven's day, of course not. But it's an unbroken lineage. So there's an aesthetic. And one of the things that always blows my mind is that we are so, we don't know how to measure time when it comes to these things. I mean, Beethoven died 1828. They made their Beethoven symphony recordings 150 years later, 130 years later, pardon me. Really, almost exactly 130 years later. That's 2 generations of musicians from Beethoven. Not much, right? Somebody got in the orchestra in the 20s. They stayed there till their 70s. They taught the next generation of people who were there in their 20s. Some of them were still playing in their 70s. And we're in the 1950s. I mean, 3 generations, 3 generations. It's not that the orchestra was full of 80-year-old decrepit people, but they were trained in that institution and in their way of playing and in their ideals of sound, which changed over the 19th century and early 20th centuries. Of course they did. But it's still, these lineages matter. The kind of instruments they played, the way they played them, and their purpose in assembling to make music. All of those things made for a tremendous tradition, which of course, the French government couldn't have cared less about, because they are, on the one hand, amazing in what they spend on culture, and on the other hand, so obsessed with being à la mode that sometimes their own history is completely forgotten and obliterated, as it has been, for example, with French Grand Opera and French choral works in the 19th century and so many aspects of French music making. Anyway, the bottom line was we have the recordings, thank God, of the Paris Conservatory Orchestra to show us what a totally different kind of sound they had. Those wonderfully perky, sec woodwinds, excellent percussion because it was coming from the tradition of theatrical music and the opera. So they're not like German orchestras, which usually had horrible sounding percussion. They had bright, tangy percussion, really, really wiry strings. I thought the Czech Phil was wiry. Oof, wait till you hear the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. Minimal vibrato, but not no vibrato. Stupid, total absence of vibrato. But a dryish sound with really, really piercing trumpets and trombones that didn't have to blast in order to cut through the texture. As you can see, my concept of the greatest orchestras for connoisseurs often involves this idea of clarity and balance and character within sections. Those are the kinds of things that I really value, and that's why I value them in these orchestras, and that's why they are the 5 greatest orchestras for connoisseurs. But if you have some other choices, feel free to let me know what they are. I'd be very interested to see alternate lists. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.